Today we're going to look at bringing color to shade gardens. Hi, I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings, and today we're going to look at how we can add beautiful bright color into shady spaces in your garden. So now if you're listening and you're like, I don't have shade in my garden, keep listening because most of these plants also can be grown in part shade and some of them even in full sun gardens. So this doesn't totally exclude you if you do not have a shady space. So when we're creating shade gardens or part shade gardens, a lot of times we talk about the foliage color, we talk about texture, because that's a lot of what the plants do is they bring foliage color and texture into those shady spaces. But I think it's also nice to bring in actual flower color, which adds bright pokes of color throughout those typically darker areas in the garden. So we're going to take a look at a list of perennials and annuals that are for those darker, shadier spaces in your garden or landscape, or a lot of these too would work even in container combinations if that's more your gardening style. So we're going to start off with a first plant that I think is so gorgeous, and I don't know, many of you may have never even heard of this plant before. It's a Spigelia, and we're going to look at the Ragin Cajun. So Spigelia Ragin Cajun is hardy in zones 5 to 9, and it gets about 24 inches tall. This is a native perennial that can be grown in full sun to full shade areas in the garden. Now, I think the more sun it gets, the more flowers you're going to have, but definitely these bright upward facing flowers that are orange and yellow or red and yellow, depending on the variety that you're getting, are a beautiful foliage, texture, flower, color plant to add into those spaces. It's deer resistant, so I know a lot of times too when we're dealing, and I don't know why this is, but I feel like a lot of times when we're dealing with more of those part shade to shade gardens, people are often concerned with deer, and I don't know, it's weird. It just feels like shadier spaces tend to be gardens that have more deer in them. Maybe I'm crazy, but that's just how it seems to me. So we're going to also try to find a lot of varieties that are deer resistant as well, because I know that deer is a big concern for many of you. So Spigelia, I don't know. I can't talk enough about it because I think it is such a beautiful, unique flower color, flower form, and just a neat addition to the garden. The other thing is they attract hummingbirds because they've got those long tubular flowers. So if you like the hummingbirds in the garden, and I'm not sure of many people who don't, this is a great hummingbird magnet flower that blooms midsummer. Another plant for shade spaces would be Bergenia, or also known as pig squeak. We're going to look here at Miss Piggy. Miss Piggy is hardy in zones 4 to 9, and it can get 18 inches tall or so by 32 inches wide. She's definitely a piggy in the garden. She likes her space. So when you are planting this in your part shade to full shade garden, make sure you give it enough room that it can kind of, I'm going to say spread. I don't mean spread like invasively, but make sure you give it enough room that that mound can continue to get bigger and bigger year after year. Miss Piggy can also be grown in full sun areas of the garden, especially here in the north. For those of you in the south, maybe not. But I know for us here north in Michigan, we have it growing in our full sun garden. And it's also a deer and rabbit resistant perennial. And the fun thing with pig squeak is they've got really thick, glossy, waxy leaves. And if you take your fingers and kind of rub on it, it makes a little squeaking noise. Thus, I think that's where the name has come from. In the spring or early season here in West Michigan, it gets beautiful pink flowers on it. It does tend to be a little bit longer blooming though, because I've even seen it blooming in our full sun garden the beginning of summer as well. So beautiful pink flowers that stand nice and tall above that really thick, dense, glossy green foliage. Another favorite of mine is bleeding heart. I love bleeding heart in the garden. And there's a lot of different bleeding heart out there, different flower forms, different plant forms. I'm going to be talking about Dicentra Valentine or Gold Heart. Those are two of my personal favorites. And what I like about them is they do have that beautiful foliage, especially Gold Heart with its chartreuse yellow-green foliage that really stands out in those darker areas of the garden. I have that one in my garden tucked in a lot of different spots because it's one of the first things that really shows color in the spring when all of my foliage starts to emerge from the ground. And then of course, when it starts blooming, it's a fantastic show of color. For me here in Michigan, it usually blooms in May, and bleeding heart are hardy in zones 3 to 9. They can get up to 3 foot tall. Again, it depends on the variety you're looking at. Some of them are shorter varieties, but both Valentine and Gold Heart are taller varieties reaching up to 3 foot tall. It's also deer resistant. And when those flowers start to emerge, the branches, they kind of do a drooping over kind of look. So it's an upright plant, upright, and then the flowers droop over, or the foliage stems, they droop over. And then you've got these little dangling hearts that kind of hang off of each of the stems. And it's such a pretty plant. That's the other thing too. Those hearts can vary in color. Sometimes they're white, sometimes they're pink, and sometimes there's red. So not only do you get foliage color changes depending on the variety, but you also do have options as far as the flower color as well. One thing I do find though is not all the time, but just depends on the season, I suppose, how warm it is in the summer. Bleeding heart can go dormant in the heat of the summer. So if you do notice that once it starts really cranking up the heat and the plant kind of starts to seem like it's fizzling and fading away, don't be concerned that it's dead. It's going through its summer dormancy because of the heat. Typically, it doesn't grow back again in the fall. You would wait until the next spring for the new foliage to emerge and for that spring blooming beauty to shine again. The next plant is Astilbes, and Astilbes have great foliage texture. Again, shade plants with a foliage texture, but there's a lot of really cool flower colors too that Astilbes have that are on the market. So Astilbe Montgomery is kind of one of my favorites with its nice, deep, rich red flower spikes midsummer. Astilbe are hardy in zones 4 to 9, and depending on the variety, some are taller, shorter than others. But they can get about 24 or so inches tall by about 18, sometimes 24 inches wide, depending on the variety and the age of the plant. Astilbe are also another deer and rabbit resistant perennial. And the flower colors are white, reds, pinks, and even some shades of purple. It's going to be a pinky purple, but it is pink that kind of tends to lead toward the purple coloration. Also, they have nice green foliage, but there are varieties out there that have the more burgundy or near black foliage as well. So if you want to kind of shake up the foliage color a little bit with Astilbes, you will see some variation in their foliage colors as well. The next plant on the list are Helleborus, also known as Lenten rose. And right now, people are going crazy for Lenten rose. They've been all over the internet, I feel like, lately, especially because in some areas of the country, they're starting to bloom right now. For us here in Michigan, typically our Lenten rose don't start to bloom until the end of March or beginning of April. The thing I like about them is they're very long blooming blooms. So once those flowers open up, they usually last from anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, and even after those flowers are spent, they still look fantastic on that plant. So sometimes spent blooms on some plants look definitely spent and no good, but on the Helleborus, the spent blooms still have a lot of interest that they add to the plant. Now we carry 2 different series. We have the honeymoon series and also the wedding party series. And I think this is a good place to let you know that if you are enjoying or wanting any of the plants that we're talking about today, you can head to our website, gardencrossings.com, and we ship all of these plants directly to your door. We also have a garden center in Zeeland, Michigan, so if you are local, we would welcome you to stop out and give us a visit in the spring, summer, or fall. So the honeymoon series being single and the wedding party being double add a lot of interest to those early season gardens, and it's nice to see the different texture that those flowers give. Both the honeymoon and the wedding party series have really nice large flowers, and they come in various colors. There's going to be shades of white and yellow and orange and pink and black and burgundy, and I'm probably missing a color. You'll have kind of more the, I'm going to say tie-dye or swirled look. Some of them are more polka dotted look. So there's a lot of different variation on flowers on hellebore. And they make a really great cut flower. So I love to cut them and actually float them in a bowl on my counter. So they're a fun flower to float for indoor enjoyment. They are also deer and rabbit resistant. So for those of you who are making a list for these great part shade to shade bloomers that are deer and rabbit resistant, I think I'm giving you a lot of great ideas here. The next one, also deer and rabbit resistant, is Pulmonaria, and this one is Pulmonaria Pink-a-Blue. And the reason Pink-a-Blue is because the flowers on this plant are pink and blue. So depending on the age of the flower, you'll have shades of pink and you'll have shades of blue or purple all on the same plant. And I think that's really cool. The other thing with Pulmonaria is it is a spring bloomer. So when those flowers have faded and are done blooming, it does have some pretty fantastic foliage as well, with it being green with white speckles on it. So it's one of those plants that's a twofer. Not only does it give you that beautiful flower color, but it also gives you fantastic foliage color as well. So hardy in zones 3 to 9, they get 18 to 24 inches tall and wide. So they kind of create a nice mounding type habit or look in the garden. They can be grown in shade to part shade gardens. And as mentioned, they are an early season bloomer. They typically bloom similar time to like when Brunnera bloom. So for us here in Michigan, usually we're seeing them bloom around April, late April, beginning of May. With their very dainty flowers, but even though the flowers are dainty, they have large clusters of these dainty flowers. So you've got your foliage mound, and then you've got these big clusters of all these beautiful pink and blue blooms on Pulmonaria. The next plant is Brunnera, and this too, I know a lot of you think, okay, Brunnera, that is known for its foliage, beautiful green foliage with white or silver veining on it. But Brunnera is another great early season perennial that has vibrant periwinkle blue blooms. Now, there's not a lot of perennials out there that have rich, true blue blooms, and Brunnera definitely is one of those plants. So if you're familiar with forget-me-not, the Brunnera blooms are identical almost to the forget-me-not blooms. With just those tiny little flowers, but lots of them for a nice, I love the periwinkle blue in the shade. Like that's a really nice contrast, I think, with the darkness of the shade, the darkness of the greens in the shade with those periwinkle blue blooms. They really pop in those darker, shadier gardens. Brunnera also is a deer-resistant perennial. So we've listed a lot of perennials that bring color to the garden. Now, a lot of them are early season bloomers, although we did list a fair amount that bloom, midsummer as well. But this is where it's important to add those annuals into your shade or part shade gardens, because your annuals are going to be the plants. They're going to be like the anchors in a sense, meaning like they're the plants that are going to take you and give you color all summer long in those dark, shady places. So let's take a look at some annuals that will do good in your part shade to shade garden. The first variety we're going to look at is a begonia, and it's part of the Double Up series. So this was introduced, I lose track of time. It feels like it was just introduced a year or two ago, but it's probably been 4, maybe 5 years now since the Double Up begonias were introduced. They have green foliage with red, white, or pink blooms, depending on the variety that you choose. These flowers are really cute, dainty rosebuds, or rosebud-looking flowers. Again, it's a plant that has a lot of clusters of these rosebud-looking blooms. So you're getting a mound that's about 12 to 18 inches tall and wide that is just full of all of these cute little rounded looking flowers. So the Double Up series has been really popular for us over the last since they were introduced, really that first year they were introduced, they sold out right away. So it's been very popular for us here at Garden Crossings. And I mean, I totally know why, because they are fantastic in the shade gardens. The next plant is a little bit maybe not as well known. It's a Browallia. We have two different varieties of Browallia. We have illumination and flirtation. So one is white and one is purple. So you can have a little bit of contrast of color if you plant them near each other. And the flowers, as they open up and they look like little stars, like little, kind of like little cupped, or they're not really cupped, but they look like little stars. And they're probably about the size of a quarter or so. And they do fabulous in part shade gardens, illuminating and flirting in the darkness there that the shade provides. They get about 20 or so inches tall and wide, and they create a nice mounding habit. They are a deer and rabbit resistant annual. And not only do they look great planted in the ground, maybe as a border or something, they also do really good in container gardens as well. If you wanted to create some really pretty container gardens with maybe a flower that not all your neighbors have, the Browallia is a good choice or a good selection in my opinion. The next plant is a fuchsia, and I know when we think of fuchsias, at least for me, when I think of fuchsias, I think of my grandma. She had these hanging baskets with all of these dangling fuchsias hanging over. The hummingbirds loved them. They made a mess on the ground because the flowers dropped, but they really were pretty. But fuchsia are known as a shade annual. But we're actually going to look at a different fuchsia that's not going to be the dangling over hanging basket type. This one is Fuchsia Firecracker. And Fuchsia Firecracker is an upright mounding habit, and definitely something different than maybe the fuchsias that you're thinking about. They can get 2 to 3 foot tall in the right conditions. I know I use them a lot in my container planters, and they get 2 foot tall for us here in Michigan. So for those of you that have a longer growing season, I would not be afraid to say they could get up to 3 foot tall for you. So as mentioned, they have a nice upright habit. They have variegated foliage. So when they are putting on their growth before it's time for them to put on their flowers, they've got really nice green and white with a hint of kind of pink in the foliage. And then when the flowers emerge, they're long tubular flowers, and they're orange in color, perfect for the hummingbirds with the very tubular looking flower. So what happens is you've got your mound of foliage, and then it sends up the flowers on kind of like a spike. And there's a lot of these little tubes that make up the flowers. And I would say each of the tubes or the flowers themselves are about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long, and very long blooming. You don't have to deadhead them, easy to care for. Just something different and unique to put in those shadier spaces. The next plant is a New Guinea impatien. So a few years ago, we dropped New Guinea impatiens. Proven winners had discontinued them. And we had a lot of requests for New Guinea impatiens. So last summer, when we were out doing our plant hunting, trying to find new varieties to introduce this year, we found the roller coaster series. Now, I know the roller coaster series has been around for a few years. It's new to us. But what really stood out with this particular series was the flowers. So there's semi-double flowers, and on the edge of all the petals, it's very ruffly. So instead of it looking just kind of like a flat impatien flower, which are pretty, it has a lot of depth and dimension to it because it is semi-double, so it's a little fuller, and then it's got that ruffled edge all the way around. They come in red and white and purple and coral and pink, pretty much all the colors, that you would look for with a New Guinea impatien. And they're about 18 or so inches tall and create a nice mounding habit. So again, great for like front of the border of the garden, or if you're doing containers, they're an excellent container plant as well. But it's one of those plants, if you wanted to add a lot of color into your shadier spaces, there's a lot of color options. You could just kind of, create like a bag of Skittles and have all different colors going on in the shade garden with this one particular plant. Another plant that also comes in a lot of variation of colors are the Rocka Poco impatiens. Rocka Poco impatiens are a fully double impatient flower, and they too look like rosebuds. And I guess I keep saying rosebuds, and I don't know why I'm saying a rosebud, because a rosebud would be closed. So it almost looks like a miniature rose. That's probably what I should be saying instead of a rosebud, is they look like a miniature rose. And they're beautiful flowers. They're about the size of a quarter. They come in reds, purples, whites, oranges, and pinks. And they're about 12 inches by about 24 inches is how big they get in the garden. A great plant for borders in the landscape. Also a nice one just to tuck here and there. Or if you're creating, shade containers, these impatiens do really well in containers as well. Now, a few years back, now this has probably been more than a few years back, there was a lot of trouble with downy mildew and impatiens in the garden, and it was wiping out all of the traditional old impatiens that people were growing. They were just getting kind of funky looking. Well, these Rocka Poco impatiens, they do fantastic and fairly disease resistant. I haven't really had any issues with them in any of the gardens that we've planted them in, and I've gotten excellent feedback from people over the years that they've been loving this Rocka Poco series of impatiens. So really pretty, something different. If you haven't tried them, I would encourage you to give them a try, because not only do they have, just the beautiful colors, because of the doubleness of the flowers, it really creates a big pop of color in the gardens. So hopefully maybe you were able to make a list and find a few new plants that you can add into your shade or part shade gardens that will help just keep them looking colorful all season long. Or even maybe it's just in a point in the year when you're feeling like your shade garden doesn't have a lot of color going on. Maybe we found for you the perfect perennial or annual solution to bring that garden space alive. If you have any questions or comments on today's video, please feel free to leave it below. If you're new to our channel, we welcome you to subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings.